Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Bradford seminar. My name is Ben Bradlow. I'm an assistant professor in sociology in SPIA. And it's my pleasure to welcome Jessica Green, our speaker for today's seminar. Jessica Green is a professor of political science at the University of Toronto, with appointments in the School of the Environment and the Monk School of Global Affairs. She received her PhD from Princeton SPIA in 2010, so it's a pleasure to welcome her back. Her work has made influential contributions to rethinking conventional wisdom in global climate governance. Her first book, Rethinking Private Authority, which was published by Princeton University Press, won Best Book Awards from the International Studies Association, American Political Science Association, and International Political Science Association, all for its account of how non-state actors serve as de facto rule makers in global environmental governance. Her new book, which she'll talk about today, is entitled Existential Politics: Why Global Climate Institutions Are Failing and How to Fix Them. It was also published last year with Princeton University Press. And it pushes this argument further. She contends that global climate institutions have been focused on the wrong problem, measuring, pricing, and trading tons of carbon, when the real political contest is over asset revaluation, who owns what, and whose assets will survive the energy transition. And I will allow her to talk about the rest of the argument. But as someone who researches green industrial transformations in the global south, the implications of Jessica's work are immediate. The questions she raises about how institutional designs entrench incumbent power, and about what it would take to build political coalitions around new economic interests, cut across political science, sociology, my discipline, and political economy. Please join me in welcoming Jessica.
Ben, that was a lovely introduction. It is a delight to be back here at Princeton, where I was molded. So it's an honor to be here and see new faces and familiar faces. I am going to talk about my book today, Existential Politics. And let me just make sure that this is, yeah. Ben set it up nicely. So this project was sort of born out of frustration. I was taught, as many political scientists were, that climate change is a sort of classic collective action problem, where everybody needs to work together in order to reduce their emissions. And the key challenge is to sort of make sure that there are no free riders and that there's no cheating. But we also know, I'm putting my glasses on so now I can actually see, that's better. We also know that we've had basically now 4 decades of multilateral cooperation through the UNFCCC and its subsequent instantiations, and we have failed to make a dent in global emissions. So this prompted me and others to ask, what if we're thinking about this problem the wrong way? What if this is not, in fact, a problem of collective action, but one of existential politics, which I define in the book as follows: a political contest between different types of asset owners, fossil, green, and vulnerable. So the conflicts between these types of actors is what produces existential politics, and these are the types of asset owners that I mean. I think I won't read through them all, but I think you get a sense of, sort of intuitively of who we're talking about here. I talk in the book about why vulnerable asset owners are not key to my analysis. And I'll return to that at the end of the talk. But basically, what I'm interested in is how asset revaluation organizes interest groups who can try to throw their power around on the global stage. And the problem, politically speaking, with vulnerable asset owners is that They are geographically diverse, they are not well organized, and they are often fighting a rearguard action. And so from a political perspective, while they're obviously critically important for what happens in climate change and climate politics, they cannot mobilize, I think, in the same ways, although there may be some caveats coming to that, as these other two sets of groups. And I should say, I take some time in the book to talk about how these are dynamic categories, and precisely because you can change from one to another, that is where the locus of some potential for pathways to decarbonization exists. So these are the three types. I'm going to focus on these two in my talk. And the basic assumption here, from a very sort of material point of view, is all actors own in all owners act in ways to preserve the value of their assets for as long as possible, right? And so we know that climate change is going to devalue fossil assets, and it will increase the value of green assets, right? And so the question is, how does the revaluation of these assets change political conflicts between these sets of actors? So the first chapter of my book is called "We Are Not All in This Together." Why? Because there are two core challenges here. One is that are based on the fundamental power asymmetry between fossil and green asset owners, right? So if climate change is really a problem of existential politics as opposed to one of collective action, then there are two core political challenges. And those are to build the power of green asset owners and to constrain the power of fossil asset owners, right? So we're not all in this together. Fossil asset owners have been running the show for decades, right? Both through, in its earliest version as outright climate denialism, then as sort of obstructionism and slow walking of climate policy, as well as greenwashing. So these are pictures from the last three COPs, the last three Conference of the Parties, in which which were hosted by oil states, and there were deep concerns about the undue influence of these states over the negotiations. And there's there's a lot of money on the table here, right? So there was a paper in Nature Climate Change a couple of years ago that says, given the the current trajectory of climate policy, we can reasonably expect about $1 trillion in stranded assets, right? And that's not spread out evenly, obviously, across the globe. There are going to be real winners and losers here. And so the challenge is to think about how to leverage the power of the potential winners to change the political dynamics of the energy transition. The problem is, we know very well who the fossil asset owners are, but the green asset owners are much fewer and farther between, right? These are producers of renewable energy, manufacturers of electric vehicles, those that build zero carbon buildings, those that put together the infrastructure that will underpin an electrified world. And they simply cannot match the political power of fossil asset owners right now. So what we need to be doing, right, is dealing with this power asymmetry. But what we're actually doing is what I call managing tons. And I define this as the narrow construction of climate change as an issue of emissions mitigation, focused on measuring, accounting for, verifying, and trading tons of greenhouse gas emissions. And what does this look like in practice? It looks like these types of policies: carbon offsets, cap and trade schemes, the ubiquitous yet somehow meaningless term net zero, and most recently, the EU carbon border adjustment tariff. And I'm going to unpack these a little bit and talk about what this means. So this is a way of reducing climate change to a collective action problem where what we do is we focus on how to measure and move around on ledgers carbon emissions. So carbon offsets, some of you may know, are kind of problematic, right? This is the idea that if you cannot reduce your emissions by a required amount, you can pay to have those emissions reduced elsewhere in the world or in the jurisdiction that you are, depending on how the policy is constructed. The problem with carbon offsets, well, first of all, let me just say, they are everywhere. This is a picture from the World Bank. They do an annual report called the State and Trends of Carbon Pricing. And this shows all of the places where offsets are used in government policies or crediting mechanisms, with the dark green being those that are implemented and the lighter green being those that are underway. There is also, I should add, a voluntary, or what I call unregulated market for carbon offsets, which at its height has been valued at about $2 billion. And that's when you go on a flight and you want to offset your carbon, you buy offsets on the voluntary market. When corporations say that they are, greening their supply chain and they've purchased offsets, that's done on the voluntary or unregulated market. So offsets are a policy that has pervaded climate change for decades. The problem with this policy is that it doesn't work very well. So first of all, most of the carbon offset projects are what are called avoided emissions. And you pay for this idea of additionality. So you pay for the difference between the carbon that is actually emitted and the carbon that would have been emitted had you not financed that project, right? This is called additionality. This is a hypothetical concept, right? There are lots of methodologies about it. I'm sure Michael will get upset at me for saying that these can be gamed, but there are ways to measure these. But at the end of the day, this is a hypothetical. You are purchasing a hypothetical absence of a commodity, which if somebody sold you that at your door, you would certainly not purchase, right? A recent study said that because of the way that these are calculated, this is a study out of the UC system, covering a fifth of the total volume of credits that have been generated both in compliance and in the voluntary market. Only about 16% of the credits issued represented real reductions. That is a very small number. And so we're buying offsets saying, actually, this is cool because, I said I emitted 100, but I paid someone else not to emit 100, but actually they did. they emitted most of that, 84, sorry. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that most offsets trade for about less than $5 a ton, which is well below the social cost of carbon, however you measure it. Most of the market is dedicated to temporary offsets, which are not, so that those emissions would resume if the trees burn down, if the project activity stops. So they're only reducing emissions for a specific period of time. There's a problem known as leakage, where the emissions activities may be reduced within the project jurisdiction, but just shifted someplace else, right? So the net outcome there is the same amount of emissions. You've just moved it from one place to another. And of course, there's this problem of cheating, of saying that you emitted you have generated emissions, but in fact you have not. So this has been well documented in many places that there are just millions of bogus credits that are floating around on the unregulated market, which some might argue is not surprising when one of the people who was charged with developing the idea of carbon offsets at the World Bank, Ken Newcomb, was indicted for creating fraudulent projects last year. This is a profoundly, he spent 30 years at the World Bank. He started up the whole sort of carbon finance branch and was found to have basically been gaming cook stove projects and milking investors out of a lot of money. We'll see. He was indicted. It's not clear whether he's not yet gone to trial. So if you ask a political scientist, none of this is surprising. Why? Because everybody who's involved in an offset project wants the numbers to add up, right? So the person who's purchasing wants to maximize the number of credits they can buy. The project developer also wants to maximize the number of credits that he or she can sell. There are middlemen who are involved in the process who also want to make sure that these transactions go through. This creates entrenched pro-offset interest, right? There's no interest in changing this system because from a process point of view, from a capital point of view, this is working. This is definitely not surprising in the voluntary market because it's not regulated. And so it's self-policed. They have discovered that these problems exist, have been extremely shocked, have had one or two big sort of efforts at reform and haven't really solved any problems. And this is, again, not surprising because there's no real incentive for quality offsets, right? If you can buy an offset for $5 a ton and put that in your annual report, why would you spend somewhere between $600 and $1,000 per ton for direct air capture, which is what it's currently selling for? There's not really an incentive to do that. So this may seem kind of niche, right? But actually, offsets are everywhere in climate policy. So anytime you hear net, like in net zero, that means offsets. When we talk about residual emissions, which are the emissions that we just don't know how to remove yet, that needs to be compensated through offsets or carbon removal. And by one measure, this is about 20% of all emissions across all nations is residual. We now have an aviation emissions agreement that seeks to limit aviation emissions, but obviously we have no carbon-free way of flying, so that is heavily reliant on emissions. There will need to be between 1 and 1.5 billion credits between 2024 and 2035. And the demand, by the way, for those credits is so huge that one of the things that Corsia has said, we will now accept credits from the voluntary market, from the unregulated market, as compliance grade for this international agreement. So we see this blending of public and private, this expansion of a policy that is very well documented to not work and unsurprising from the perspective of all of the political incentives in place. So this is a classic example of managing tons. Carbon pricing also has problems. This is a very unpopular opinion. But this is from just last week. Many of you may know that EU ETS is the largest and sort of best established carbon pricing scheme in the world. It's been going since 2005. In 2014, it was having problems with pricing, and so one of the things it did was establish essentially a central bank called the Market Stability Reserve. And that central bank, when there's certain criteria are met, has the authority to take credits, to take allowances out of circulation, right, to regulate the price of an individual allowance. And it worked great. It worked really well. After the Market Stability Reserve was put in place, prices started to rise, and they're now among some of the highest prices in the world. I would say maybe upper third. But even this very robust carbon pricing system, which has been heralded as a model throughout the world, has just run into an obstacle, which is the war in Iran. And a number of countries called for basically a suspension of using the market stability reserve to regulate prices because of fears of rising prices as a result of the war. So, and that in fact happened last week. So we can expect to see prices either stay the same or fall over the next little while. So again, ask a political scientist. They would tell you this isn't a great policy from a political perspective because it has very visible upfront costs. Where I live in Ontario, our conservative premier ran against the carbon price, axed the tax campaign, and he literally put stickers on the gas pumps that says your gas costs, 4 cents more a liter or whatever it was because of the carbon price. So very visible upfront costs, backloaded benefits, right? Maybe later we'll have a less change climate, but can you please pay more for your gas right now? Vulnerable to changing political winds, right? So as the example from the EU ETS shows, when disturbances happen, things get more expensive, energy gets more expensive, there's pressure for retrenchment, which makes perfect sense and is true for many other policies. But the problem is that the logic, of course, of a carbon price is that you're sending a steady signal to markets and to firms to make investment choices. So if you repeal or you change the price, then they're not going to respond in the way that you expect. There is the obvious point that people don't usually talk about, which is that the whole idea of a carbon price is to is to price the externalities of carbon emissions. But of course, in fact, most major oil-producing countries, there's also huge subsidies at work, working at cross purposes, which lower the price of those externalities. So we have all of these problems. And the effects on emissions are debated. Now, this is, I wrote a paper in which I said, if you look carefully at the actual studies of the ex post of the performance of carbon pricing schemes, you'll see that the effects are quite limited. In fact, the most likely case, which is the EU ETS, is on average 1 to 2% reductions per year. That made some people very angry, and they said that's not true. We can argue about that, but I think there's at least a robust discussion about what the effects actually are and how you tease that apart from other climate policies. So if this is a policy that makes people angry and has a limited effect on emissions or a debatable effect, it's not going to be the best bang for your buck, politically speaking. Whoops, that's the wrong way. So a lot of people say, well, if the prices were higher, I had to put this in because I don't know, it scratched an itch for me. This is a recent review of my book. It says, and I think it's helpful because it's demonstrative of the problem of how we think about, well, if we have that policies work in the absence of a political context, right? And so people say, well, gee, if the prices were just higher, then carbon pricing would work better. But there's a reason they're not higher. The reason is because it's politically infeasible to do so. This is just gives you a sense of, again, this is from the World Bank's carbon dashboard of prices around the world. And you do see that there's some quite high ones, right? But most of them are below, I would say, about $60 a ton. And if you average this out across economies and across sectors, so if you do an emissions-weighted average carbon price, oops, sorry, I don't know what happened there. What you will find is that the global average carbon price now is about $5 a ton. Right, and the IPC. So for comparison, the IPCC estimates that prices need to be in 2015 $90 a ton by 2030, and $210 by 2050 to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius. So that's we're not We are not there. And I will also say this blue bar here says that the blue shows this is the extent to which the contribution is from ETSs versus carbon taxes. So you see more of a contribution from ETSs, that increase in price, and that's driven, by the way, by the EU. So the EU is driving the actual sort of global increase in price, driven largely by the EU, global increase in the average price. So these are sort of two examples of managing tons that I talk about in the book. It has, obviously, a lot of problems. One, it assumes that measurement and commodification of emissions will lead to climate solutions, which we don't have a whole lot of evidence for that at this point. Two, it buries politics in numbers, right? If we're focused on measuring, we're not focused on the fundamental conflict between asset owners. It allows obstructionists to redirect efforts towards counting emissions rather than reducing them. I think it says a lot when companies like BP and Exxon come out in support of a carbon pricing, of a cap and trade scheme, right? Because they know that they can then be involved in influencing how those policies are shaped in a way that reduces their compliance costs. Obviously, it makes this a question of technical expertise, and oftentimes those are fossil asset owners, though not exclusively. And this is one of the critiques of the Paris Agreement is that it creates a source of agreement amidst gridlock, right? Because it says, okay, well, we can all agree that we're going to do a pledge, we're going to have a nationally determined contribution, and we're going to review it, and it's going to get bigger. But it doesn't address the underlying conflicts of the redistribution that's happening because of asset revaluation. And finally, to the extent that we're all engaged in doing these things, we are legitimating this approach and saying, this is fine, this is good, we're making progress. When in fact, all of the evidence suggests that that is not the case. Okay, so I've spent a lot of time saying what's bad about what we're doing now. What can we do instead? And my argument is basically we need to focus on assets, right? If asset revaluation is what's driving the conflict, then let's focus on those and not on managing tons. So I talk about a few different things in the book. First, I'm going to talk about investment protections, and follow me. This gets a little bit wonky, but bear with me for a moment. This describes a case between the oil and gas company Rockhopper and the government of Italy. And it's a clear-cut case of what's wrong with investment law right now. So in 2005, Rockhopper received a permit to do some exploration for oil and gas off of Italy's coast. Fine. 5 years later, Italy said, you know what, we don't want to do any more offshore oil extraction. And therefore, Rockhopper was no longer able to continue its exploration. So under the terms of the Energy Charter Treaty, Rockhopper sued Italy and said that the denial of this concession was essentially an illegal expropriation, which would result in a loss of profits. And this is all the Energy Charter Treaty and many, over 2,000 bilateral investment treaties are governed by an arbitration body called the Investor State Dispute Settlement System, which is a bit of a mouthful. It's an arbitration body that is empowered to adjudicate disputes between firms and governments, and it ordered the Italian government to pay Rockhopper almost 250 million euro in restitution. So this particular case has gone through a number of twists and turns, but the basic premise here is what's most important, which is that oil and gas companies are being protected by the ISDS, right? And if we care about leveling the playing field between fossil and green asset owners, then these kinds of things can't, are not helping us. They're hurting. it so happens, and this is mostly based on the work of Kyla Tianhara and her colleagues, the ISDS is very good for the fossil fuel industry. There are, of course, other cases under the ISDS, but it has made huge payouts to the fossil fuel industry. The average award is $600 million. And this has had a terrible effect on some countries. Joe Stiglitz calls this litigation terrorism, because even the threat of a lawsuit can prompt states to delay climate action. And some governments have said, yes, in fact, we have delayed climate action because we're fairly confident that we would get sued. What can we do about this? Well, I'm a pragmatist, and a lot of this book is motivated by thinking about, okay, well, we have this big international system of organizations. Many of them are focused on moving assets or not around the global economy. How can we use the existing ones to help solve this power asymmetry between fossil and green asset owners? And it turns out that investment protections is one place to do that. And here's why I think it's a good place to think about. So the Energy Charter Treaty is kind of the main treaty that's under the under the authority of or is adjudicated by the ISDS. Countries spent many years trying to modernize that in order to solve this problem that I just described with Rockhopper. Many people said it didn't go far enough, but that process was sort of mooted by the fact that it wasn't concluded, but countries have started to just unilaterally withdraw from the Energy Treaty and to exclude ISDS provisions in new investment treaties. And this will be a big question, I think, for the renegotiation of CUSMA. So for example, speaking of CUSMA, when it was updated, ISDS provisions between the US and Canada were excluded, which meant that there was this little thing called the Keystone XL pipeline, which a company in Canada was planning to build into the US, TC Energy. And when Biden canceled it, TC Energy threatened to sue the US government for $15 billion. Now, this was summarily sort of thrown out because the updated version of CUSMA did not have these investment protection. So, we don't need to be making TC Energy $15 billion richer for a pipeline that we don't need to be building. So there are these unilateral changes happening. There are countries that are withdrawing or not renewing their ISDS provisions, and there are other efforts that are kind of working in tandem here, such as to kind of support this idea of aligning investment practices with climate protection goals. The OECD has a work program that it's been working on for a couple of years, and then there is this thing called the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, which is basically helping countries develop credible transition pathways and have NDCs reflect this transition without oil and gas. So that's one way we can think about constraining the power of fossil asset owners. The other piece is the trickier piece, arguably, in some ways, because it's much more varied. It's how do we take that green question mark and make it into some people and stuff, right? And we do that through green industrial policy. Green industrial policy, as Ben was sort of alluding to, it has two kind of important pieces to it. One, obviously, it helps us make the things that we need for a decarbonized economy, but also, importantly, has the secondary, or maybe primary, effect of building political constituencies that support the expansion of green assets. And so we need to, shift away from managing tons to thinking about how we do this. And of course, the problem is this will vary hugely by country, right? This is not something that is much more difficult to think about, okay, well, what are the international institutions that we have in place to help promote this? There are some, they go pretty deep into the weeds, and also that relies on trade, which is not really a regime anymore. So we can talk about that more in the Q&A. But I talk about some principles to help guide green industrial policy. One is to start with carrots. This is based on work that I've done with Wei Peng, who's here. We need carrots first for producers and then sticks. So that reverses the logic of carbon pricing, which is basically sticks first. Carrots alone won't work. Also, they're very expensive, but it's a good place to start to build political constituencies where you may then be able to expand into other types of regulations. You need to focus on decarbonizable industries like electricity generation and auto manufacturing, and these are places that are ripe for conversion. Like, we have the technology, it's scalable, and if we can flip these, from fossil to green asset owners, we can start sort of moving the pile, as it were, towards broader support for decarbonization policy. And a third, and this is, I think, coming up more and more, is that, and again, it's addressed directly in the just transition literature, but is now becoming a question for those who are more focused on industrial policy, is we need people. We need people to do all this stuff, and they need to be trained, and some need to be upskilled, some need to be reskilled. So that is something that we need to think about as well. This is a figure from two colleagues who wrote about decarbonizable industries. It's not my idea, but what it shows here, right, is how you can begin to sort of come up with carrots that will help expand this coalition, right, and break and fragment the previous fossil coalitions. Okay, so that's kind of some of the basic ideas of the book in a nutshell, but of course, a lot has changed. I was saying to Ben, I turned in the manuscript right after Trump was elected, the galleys once he took office, and now we've gone through several world orders since then. Obviously, the liberal international order is in a tailspin, but there are some things that we know which may help us navigate through whatever it is that's happening now. One is that there is a clear trade-off between free trade and decarbonization, right? This can be boiled down to the sentence, we need China, because they have cheap, renewable technology. We're having a big fight, actually, now in Canada, much more so, I think, than in the US, about so Carney has lifted some of the restrictions, and we're now importing something like, I think, 20,000 EVs, something, a very small number. But there are people who are now, that also, since the price of gas has spiked, who are clamoring for cheap EVs, right? And we're not going to build them in Canada. That's not going to happen, not in the next year, right? So there's a clear trade-off there. There is, to quote Niles Gilman's work, an emerging schism between what he calls electrostates and petrostates. Other people have used this terminology. But just the idea that this isn't just about the technologies that you use, but how you are going to align politically and economically. Where are these new sort of trade blocks going to be? And is it possible that middle powers like us in Canada or other emerging economies, if they choose to align with electrostates, create stable trading partners, figure out how to specialize at different points in the supply chain, that could actually accelerate the transition. And obviously we see playing out in the paper every day how the war in Iran is changing the calculus on fossil fuels, although it's not clear how that's going to play out. This is from the Financial Times a couple, maybe like 10 days ago. More investment in batteries as there is a greater demand for electrified power. It's not, but again, we also see the other thing on the other end of the spectrum. There are calls in Canada to double down on building pipelines, and we need more LNG for export because the oil markets are so volatile, right? So it's not clear. And also I should say that this volatility of prices, oil prices, changes the investment context for private capital. Like, it could be the case that private capital just would much rather shell out with the support of, sorry, I shouldn't touch that, with the support of governments for the stability of prices that renewables will guarantee if we're going to have ongoing conflict in the Middle East. So just to wrap up here, I think looking ahead, there's a few, I think the book raises some questions as well. You know, I mentioned that I don't consider vulnerable asset owners explicitly in the book, and I explain why, but it is the time's a-coming when they will become a real political force. Particularly, I think two institutionalized forms of them are pensions and the insurance industry, right? And the insurance industry also underpins the housing industry, or the housing sector. And if we don't have a housing sector, then we don't have much of an economy. So I think this is, you know, as these payouts become more and more, there have been lots of efforts to figure out how to commodify and recommodify and distribute risk, but you can only do that for so long. So I think that's a real question. Another question is, when I talked about this idea of technology adoption, flipping firms from from fossil to green, what are the conditions under which, you know, industry leaders can help catalyze whole sectors for doing that? We don't have good data or theories about that. And then the final thing is, like, just to talk about a little bit more about what the war is doing, what the you know, increasing grab for critical minerals is doing, is that it's transforming this problem of climate into one of just geopolitics, right? Or what, you know, some people have referred to as competitive decarbonization, right? This is a structural change to the economy. It is certainly no longer about managing tons, although some people have not yet gotten that memo. So maybe we get to an energy transition much more quickly when we stop talking about climate change, particularly in countries like this one, and to a lesser extent Canada, but other emitters like Australia, big emitters I should say, where it's become very polarized. So we just take that word out of the equation and we talk about, you know, economic growth or economic security or the social contract or investment in jobs or whatever you want to call it, and then we're, you know, it's a very different ballgame. So I will leave it there. Actually, no, apparently I have one more slide, which says all of the things I just told you. So it's just a pitch for saying we really need to think about this in the context of power asymmetries rather than how we measure and trade tons of carbon dioxide. Thanks.
One of the great puzzles behind this has been the electoral politics of it, and not just in the United States, where the climate issue has never yet managed to make itself as important as you know, the national security thing. And in fact, it clearly isn't as important right now. So you can't blame. I mean, this kind of is a situation we're in, where something looks like something good is going to happen, and then politics in some important country turns around, and all of a sudden, what was done starts to be rolled back. That's the kind of thing that's going to happen. You can't, and if there's a war, of course you expect everything. It's not a matter of throwing away carbon currency. Anything big on any front except focusing on national security at that point is going to be thrown away. So, to my mind, what happens is climate as an issue, because it has such a long time span, has to develop in a world where it's almost never going to be the central issue, when other things are always going to temporarily take its place, if it temporarily happens to be very important. And where you have to think about things that are very long-term, that are very robust, that if something happens, it might get, policy might not get knocked off, but it comes back on track. And we've never really been able to say exactly what that is. The one constant in all of this is that technological change, which I never thought of as the solution to the problem, nevertheless, is the one thing that keeps powering both what governments are willing to do and what people are willing to do because of the price. So to my mind, solving the problem has to do with trying to figure out what are the aspects of a problem that you can figure out that if you make a change now, it's going to be robust against all this other stuff. And as you say, maybe not talking about climate is sometimes the answer. But on the other hand, sometimes it is the answer because those people in the middle, people who get damaged by it, sometimes become important. And so it's a strange mixture of policy. You can't just do one thing and go away. But you have to start setting things in place which are going to be robust. The U.S. made all kinds of investments in all kinds of energy infrastructure, energy research and development also, as China has, and now that's coming, that's helping. So, what's that list of things that are not like, this is what we're going to change the world, we're all going to make net zero by 2050.
Right.
That's always going to get blown away. But
Right.
what's the stuff that really will stick?
Yeah, I mean, that's a hard question. I think, so to me, let me answer it this way. To me, I think we have globalization, by which I mean opening of economies, has fooled us into thinking that private capital can solve a lot of problems. And the energy transition is a series of different kinds of market failures that require government investment. And so I think what the government investment looks like will vary by country, but that is really what we're talking about. And I think that investment goes with restoring some of the social contract that has been, chipping away for the last few decades, which will make people, I would hope, more amenable to change. I mean, the reason that there's so much resistance is people are frightened. They don't know what's coming next, and everyone's operating with less and less of a safety net, right? So I think to me, the thing that is robust is the money that gets sunk into things that is hard to, that people can get behind. I don't have a better answer than that. And I think a lot of that answer is going to be very localized, So I was telling Wade this morning, there's this whole debate right now about a Stellantis plant in Brampton, and it used to employ 3,000 people, and then it shut down because Stellantis changed its plans, and it wasn't going to do ICE vehicles anymore. And now it's decided, well, we're only going to produce, we're going to have the cars assembled at this plant, but that only restores a fraction of the jobs. And the politicians are mad, and they're saying, this is not acceptable, but they're not coming up with another solution, right? Which would be, okay, how can we make the investment environment more attractive for Stellantis so that they actually come back and maybe it's not actually assembling, maybe it's doing something else. I don't know, but let's have a conversation about how to fix that problem. And so the only thing that's happening now is that unions and politicians are yelling at this multinational corporation who are just saying, well, sorry, the numbers don't add up, right? So that's not a surprise. So that is the question. I mean, like David Victor and Chuck Sable would say, well, this is about these very decentralized conversations between regulators and firms. And I have to say, at first I didn't believe them, but now David's always right, it's annoying. Now I'm coming around to his point of view.
Adam and then Wade.
Thank you for the talk. I look forward to reading your book after the semester's over and we have time for such things. I had a question about the sort of conception of ownership claims as underlying this setup. You sort of allude to this, but ownership claims are often liquid or fungible in some way.
Yeah.
but not all of them. And so some of, if you start breaking down these, fossil owners to the ones who are like the Saudi sovereign wealth fund, right? That's very different than just a pool of financial assets that can, shift to something else rather quickly. And so I guess once you sort of start blurring those categories or thinking about them a little more sort of dynamically like that, what does that do to the analytic sort of set?
Yeah, so I do talk about that a bit in the book, and that's absolutely correct. And so to me, so the fungibility issue is less the issue because, firm A can sell to firm, fossil asset owner A can sell to fossil asset owner B. Fossil asset owner A is no longer a fossil asset owner, but it doesn't matter because it's just transferred those interests to another, right? But there is an asset specificity question, right? Where there are some owners who can divest themselves more readily at lower cost of some of their assets, which makes them potentially more malleable in their interests if they can be incentivized to do so than others. And there are some that just ain't, right? Like Saudi are like, we're not, there's nothing we can do about that, right? So that is a difficult question. And I think there's a lot more room for, I mean, in some ways I think about this book as sort of like a first crack at like thinking about firms as the unit of analysis, but on multiple levels, right? Because they operate as individual firms, they operate sectorally, some are vertically integrated, they operate multinationally, and all of those slices will have different implications for the fungibility. But 100%.
Yeah, I love this, first of all, Jess. I guess my question is a follow-up to both Adam's question and Michael's question. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about one point you were making, about how can we better support and grow the Green Coalition or constituency. Because I think to Michael's point, I do agree that technology improvement is what gives hope, but I also feel that it's not sufficient to just make technologies cheap and clean, right? We need to strategically make the green industries more organized, politically organized, and make their voice heard. So I feel that there's a lot more that we need to think strategically about how to make that work. And also to Adam's point, I think there's another thing about how to potentially make some of the green coalitions so that they can fracture the fossil industry, as you were saying just now. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that. Like empirically, have we seen evidence that those things can happen, or do we have theories of change so that the green coalition can actually have the power that we wish they could have in order to rebalance the power?
Yeah, well, so I mean, the Jonases have done more research. Jonas Nahm and Jonas Meckling have done more research on this than I have. And I think that the answer is that there are strategies for building green coalitions, but they depend a lot on what the government institutions are. And from what I've read of their work, you're like nodding in agreement. From what I take away from their work is like corporatist countries do a lot better than at striking bargains with industry. And so to me, that's very helpful for those countries and also a real constraint of the generalizability of the lessons. So I don't have a great answer to that. I think also, so that's one piece. And the first question, I think that I know that labor is a really under-theorized part of green industrial policy. I've looked, it's just not there, right? And I think the statistic is that 70% of employment in OECD countries is in the service industry, right? Or something like that. So we have to have some strategic thinking about who's gonna do all this stuff. Because right now, right, the pushback is real anxiety about what's my job gonna be, and we have, I'm sure you see it in your undergrads, we have this idea that everyone's gonna work in an office, right, and have a career, and yet undergrads are having real difficulties getting jobs, and it's well, there's a structural transformation of the economy happening, and so that happens at every level, and we're not training, I don't know, I'm getting a little beyond my skis here, but like, we're not. I don't think we're training people at the scale probably that we need to for those kinds of, for that kind of new set of institutions.
So following up on Wei and Michael's point, I was curious specifically to hear your thoughts about the IRA. If I understood your points correctly, it's an example of the kind of solution to these problems that you recommend. I realize that your book was published right before the election, but
so much changed.
how do you explain why it wasn't as politically sustainable as it was meant to be?
So, there are people who are definitely more expert in this than I am. I think the best argument I can say is like there just wasn't enough time, right? That these, it had like maybe 2 years of like fully fledged operation. And, I think it was interesting when the rollback started, like a lot of, a number of car companies were like, don't roll back the consumer subsidies. We want you to keep the consumer subsidies, because they had already made capital allocations, investment decisions, or we're going to build this stuff because people are going to buy it because there's the subsidies. And then when, the government pulled the rug out from under that, they were like, no, 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 right? And so I think that failure is a demonstration of how that could work, right? Is that it is guiding the economy, right? It just didn't have time to go, as far, I think, as it could have. And yeah, that's my best answer for that.
Yeah, can we have one short question? You.
Hi, my name is Soya, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Princeton University. Thank you so much for the presentation. And as I was reading your Nature paper on model inheritance in this book, I was wondering how you see the role of global climate institutions for sequencing sticks after carrots. Because I see in Korea, it's very difficult to implement discipline on steel firms, petrochemical, all the important industries for Korea's economy, which makes it politically difficult not only to increase carbon price, but also to implement other performance standards or regulatory standards.
So the question is, how do we implement sticks after carrots at a global level?
Yeah, I wonder if you see a role for global institutions to sort of help to create signals for companies.
I mean, I talk about the sticks of the ISDS is one stick. I also talk about tax policy as another stick. But I think regulating firms is mostly done at the domestic level, right? I mean, there could be, you in an alternate universe, you could maybe think about some sticks that are created through the trade regime, but like that's not really a thing anymore, so I wouldn't spend time on that.
Thanks very much for this wonderful talk. Thank you for visiting us in Princeton.
Thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure. Thank you.